Welcome everybody to today's Cultivating Success webinar. Today's topic is season extension. This is the second webinar in our 2021 Small Farm and Ranch webinar series. The Cultivating Success program is a partnership of University of Idaho Extension and the WSU Food Systems program. It was started as a collaboration between University of Idaho Extension, Washington State University Extension, and the nonprofit organization Rural Roots over 20 years ago. This is actually our fourth season of offering webinars, and we're really delighted today that two of our excellent small farm and food systems extension educators, Jen Werlin, who's located in Teton County, and Melissa Hamilton, who's located in Valley County, are going to be presenting today on season extension. I'm Colette D. Phelps. I am facilitating today's webinar. I'm an extension educator in community food systems located on the Moscow campus. Also with us today is Mackenzie Lawrence. You may have seen emails from Mackenzie. She is our technical whiz and is going to be able to troubleshoot any technical issues that you might experience. So a couple of webinar tips. If you close the other programs that are running on your computer, you can dedicate all of your bandwidth to the webinar. That could definitely help with the speed of your sound and the transition of slides. If at any time you are having problems, in the control bar, which is generally at the bottom of your screen, is going to be a chat box. Please go ahead and type into that chat box any of the issues that you're having, and Mackenzie will assist you. If you have questions for the speakers at any time, you can type into the Q&A box. That is a really nice spooling feature that allows us to separate technical assistance from the questions you have from the speakers. So please type in your questions at any time, and there will be times throughout the webinar that we will ask those questions on your behalf. The handouts have been sent to you through I believe the chat. Let me take a look at that. Mackenzie is going to put them into the chat, and then you'll be able to download the handouts from the chat. They will also be emailed to you. We do have a question in the chat from Andy about whether or not the participants are muted. And yes, participants are muted in webinar format. That makes sure that we don't have background noise, which is why we ask you to use the Q&A box to ask any questions that you have of our speakers today. So again, any questions, go ahead and type those in the Q&A, technical assistance in the chat. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Melissa. So thank you for being here today.
Melissa, I think you're muted. We can't hear you.
Hi, try again.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today. I'm the extension educator in Valley County, and I'm excited to present with Jen in Teton County. And season extension is something that we have to do out of necessity where we live. And so we'll be sharing our knowledge and experience in utilizing season extension, and then happy to answer any questions. And if we don't have the answers, happy to help you find those answers. And so today I'm going to be going over kind of just why in general do you need season extension and some things to consider. Low tech solutions, medium tech, high tech, and then we'll give you some resources at the very end. So as you all know, because I imagine you're gardeners, and I would love to actually just know a little bit more too about who is in this webinar before we kind of dive into it. So in the chat room, if you could just put your name, where you're located, and your season, how many growing days do you have in your season, that would be really helpful for us as presenters. And then I guess if you had to say, you know, your experience, if you feel like you're confident in low, medium, or high-tech season extension, that would be something I would also like you to put into that chat room. And so feel free to do chat room introductions. And one thing that you can do on Zoom that you can't do in person is that you can have conversations on the side. So if there's something that we say that inspires you, feel free to plug that into the chat going, wow, that's a great idea, or that sparked this question for me. And so feel free to have that ongoing conversation in chat as Jen and I present. And so do your research. I'm hoping that most of you attending here today know how long your growing season is. And you can find out this information by initially going to the USDA zone and doing kind of your plant hardiness zone map to figure out what your zone is. And then also checking out extension publications to be able to figure out how many days do I have in my growing season by knowing your first and last frost date. Oftentimes, if you live in a difficult growing season, such as Valley County, there's no real definitive first and last frost date. And for example, we can have a frost at any given time throughout the summer. And so we have to be prepared by having our season extension infrastructure in place to be able to protect the plants that we have against those random frosts that we can have throughout the growing season. Once you know your hardiness zone, it's important to check in with cultural knowledge and take that, kind of just to understand more about where you live, but don't make the cultural knowledge actually be the indicator of what's possible. Because I know at least in Valley County, there's a lot of people that say, oh, you can't plant until the snow's off that mountain. And if you were to wait for the snow to melt off that mountain, it would be, the middle of June. And while that might be true for some of the worm living plants like tomatoes, you might not want to get them in the ground right away. There's still a lot you can do with some of the cold hardy plants before that middle of June date. And so really know your growing region and ask for cultural knowledge. The local master gardeners are also just a wealth of information, and they have some training on growing, and they might tell you something different than don't plant until the snow's gone from the mountain. They might actually be able to tell you, well, I get my stuff in as soon as the snow melts, but I get specific things in a specific way. So ask around, gather that cultural knowledge, and then be observant about where you are planning on growing, to look at your microclimates and understand where those might exist, and think about, if something, if you identify a microclimate in on your property, then think about, the placement of your greenhouse, or the placement of your low tunnel, or the placement of where you might want to grow your tomatoes, your cucumbers, and some of those warm living plants. And so in Valley County, I'll encourage people to look at where the snow might melt off first, and be observant during the spring to figure out, where are those warmer areas on my landscape. And so start to really tune into those in your area, on your property, and try to identify microclimates. Some common areas microclimates might exist is if there's like a structure up against a house, up against a barn, if there's a large rock, if there's a rock wall. Sometimes the slope of a property can create microclimates or areas where cold air will sit. And so just be observant and take a season to get to know your land before you jump in and build out some infrastructure on a place that maybe isn't suited best to hold it. So this is a picture of me getting overzealous in the spring and planting before I had my season infrastructure in place. And so I had extra zucchini seed starts, and I gave them away to neighbors, but I just got excited in the spring and thought, oh, I'm going to plant them anyway, and I'll throw a frost cloth over and I'll put it up against the fence. And I just wanted to kind of just reiterate, it's important to have season extension in place before you get planted, because if you put your gardening heart and soul into these plants and you nurture them all year long, and then they get taken out by a frost, it's essentially on you because you didn't plan ahead. And so don't improvise too much, have a plan, you can see here that my plan was to throw a frost cloth up over and pin it up against the fence, and I used rocks and pieces of lumber to secure it. But with that weather event, there was also a lot of wind, and my makeshift attempt at covering my plants was not sufficient. And so as you go into this season extension journey, understand your goals. Are you wanting to do it to simply extend your growing season? For example, in Valley County, we have 60 days. And so, you know, people will use season extension at the beginning and at the end of those 60 days to try to get their plants started earlier, or prolong their harvest, or prolong the season so they can get a harvest. And so know if that is your goal. Another goal might be that you want to actually grow throughout the winter. And so if you want to create season extension infrastructure that's going to allow you to grow throughout the winter, that's going to look really different than just wanting to grow to extend the season. And then consider your site selection, and that kind of goes into that microclimate concept, and be thoughtful about where you're going to place the infrastructure that you build. Think about the maintenance and the depreciation of this infrastructure. This goes back to having a plan. I've seen both gardeners and farmers enter into season extension infrastructure and not really know all of the ins and outs of what it would take to maintain it throughout the winter. And so, you know, if you do get snowfall, think about if you're willing and wanting to remove snowfall from that structure so it doesn't collapse. And so either, you know, you're gonna have to remove it from the top or remove it from the side so it doesn't collapse from the inside. And if that's something that you don't want to do, then think about having to remove the glazing in the fall. And then some farmers will actually just take the structure down completely. And so they'll assemble it in the spring and then take it apart in the fall and store it. And so have a plan for how you want to be able to maintain this space for harsh climates, like if there's a lot of snowfall. Also, if you are wanting to build raised beds, think about the materials that you're using and think about the depreciation of those materials. And so, for example, you might choose to build raised beds out of pine, which would keep your costs lower up front. But overall, long term, you'll have a higher labor cost because the pine is not going to hold up for the same amount of time as if you chose to use a redwood or a cedar. And so think about your equipment and your supplies when you go into the creation of building that infrastructure out. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jen, and she's going to go over to the low and medium tech, and then I'll pick up at the end of the presentation. Thank you all for introducing yourself into the chat.
All right. Are you seeing?
We see your desktop, and now we see Hardiness and planting calendar.
The correct slide?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, because it was not working earlier. Worked in, of course, during our run through. So I'm Jen Werlin, and I noticed in the chat, a lot of you are in kind of more mountainous areas, but I think that most of you on this Zoom webinar are not in as cold of a spot as me. So that's good news for you. I am in Teton Valley. We're in zone 4B, and season extension is vital. And it's vital, obviously, throughout the state, but particularly in these short season, high altitude climates. So Melissa referenced a little bit about your hardiness, or the USDA zones and hardiness. And it's important to keep in mind what you're going to plant and adjust your expectations based on whatever you're planting, as well as just figuring out your calendar. And this in and of itself could be the whole presentation, but really briefly, trying to find some plants that are at least half or semi-hardy to hardy. And there's a lot of variation depending on the crop that you're growing. But for hardy plants, you can typically put direct sow those about 6 to 8 weeks before the hard frost. And for semi-hardy plants, that's about 2 to 4 weeks before the last killing frost. And for any tender plants, I highly recommend using season extension and starting your seedlings early. And you can use do seedling starts indoors or also in some of our season extension structures and infrastructure that we have. One thing to keep in mind is that tender plants, they include things like cucumber, eggplant, okra, pepper, pumpkin, squash, tomato, watermelon, and basil. And in our area, people can grow some of the larger hard squashes, but they usually do that in a high tunnel or some sort of season extension structure. And one thing to keep in mind, if you're starting seedlings, the root crops typically do not like to be transplanted. You have to be very careful. So just keeping that in mind. There's some resources at the U of I Extension publication page, and they're listed on this slide. And you can check those out, as well as a spring vegetable planting guide for Idaho. What you see on this slide is some examples of some low-tech solutions. The item on the left is called a wallow water. They're actually quite effective in season extension. And they're basically creating a microclimate for your plant. And they use this UV resistant plastic cover, and you fill each little tube that's surrounding the plant with water. And the idea is that it heats up during the day and it retains the solar heat. And at night, when temperatures plummet, it helps to keep more of that constant warm temperature. And so in our area, tomatoes and peppers do quite well in these devices. And if you have it in maybe a container, if you're a gardener and maybe not a farmer, you can put it in a container. You can even extend your season that way as well, or move it indoors if it gets to be a big, if there's a really threat of a hard frost. Some other less expensive options include plastic bottles and jugs. Some people even just surround their plants filled with these jugs of water, and that can create a little microclimate. And then the little item that you see in the center of the screen is a cloche, and you can create those also with, I have friends that are small farmers and have over 300 person CSA. They use recycled pickle jars, and they get their seedlings started in a little cloche inside a high tunnel. So there's a lot you can do. Raised beds are a great option if you have the money and the infrastructure to start with those. If you don't want to create little like wooden raised beds, you can actually mound the soil and create your own little raised bed in your garden, and that can be more cost effective. And so again, you're just mounding the soil, creating that little microclimate, and it allows the soil to heat up quicker. With raised beds, you can typically extend your season by about a month. So maybe 2 or 4 weeks earlier in the season, and even later into the season, into the fall, 2 to 4 weeks later. So it could potentially create a 2-month extension of your growing season. One nice advantage of raised beds is it helps to reduce the weeds. And if you don't have the ideal soil, or there's a lot of issues and lots of compaction or even just heavy rocks in our area, we have areas with it's just very rocky. You can bring in your own soil and you can create that ideal texture and soil structure. And with raised bed that you see in these pictures, typically we do a 1-to-1 mix of compost and topsoil. As you can see on this, on the picture on the right, you can see those little pickle jars, and they basically just cut the bottom off, and it's a really innovative solution. And then it's inside a raised bed. It's and then it has the greenhouse grade fabric or the plastic on the outside. Floating row cover is a must, and this is actually probably one of the least expensive and more accessible resources that you can use. This is often called Remay, so that's just a commercial brand. There's lots of different thicknesses and various brands of row cover. And you use these to protect just with those cool evenings. And then another advantage is it also helps to reduce pests. It reduces insect and other garden pests from getting in and destroying your plants. One thing that it does do, if you keep your floating row cover on all the time, it can reduce pollination. So just leaving it there all the time is not really recommended. But in our area, we can pretty much garden with this row cover all summer long. You'll typically have to take off the row cover when it gets over 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So in Teton Valley, we don't have many days that get over 85 degrees. But again, it can prevent pollination if you're needing that. So I recommend using bricks or rocks to secure the fabric versus the staples, because once you get a tear in that fabric, it's just like a piece of paper. Once things start tearing, it can really rip, and it's expensive to replace the row cover year after year. I do recommend covering your plants when you have a forecast that predicts it's going to drop lower than 38 degrees Fahrenheit. A little bit more about the row cover. The transparency of the cover is important. So the lighter fabrics allows more sunlight to penetrate through, and it's about 85 to 90% of the light can get through. So that typically you can leave it on for the most part. A medium weight fabric allows about 70% of the light to transmit, and it's recommended that you remove that during the day, but it also will provide more protection for those cold nights. Then frost cloth allows less than 50% of the light to go through. You'll use that during a frost event, and so make sure to remove that the following day to allow the plants to get sunlight for optimal growth. And then this next slide showcases just some of the different terms that are often interchangeable. But for the sake of this presentation, we're going to really refer these to the permanence on the landscape. So there's cold frames, there's low tunnels, high tunnels, and greenhouses. For medium tech solutions, these include,
Jen?
Yes.
If you wouldn't mind, before we jump into the next presentation, we did have some questions that came in that might be easier to ask while we're still thinking about the other season
I'm
extension
not
techniques.
seeing them on my screen. I'm wondering how I can see them.
Well, I'm happy to read them.
Okay,
So
great.
Mindy asks about the pickle jars. She says, I'd like to know how the pickle jar cloches work. Do you have to remove them every morning and put them on every evening to keep the plants from burning? With the bottoms cut off, do you need the lids to trap the heat?
No, so actually, this was, I thought, just a creative, low-cost solution to season extension. One of my friends who's a farmer, he was able to obtain a bunch of pickle jars from a deli over in Jackson, Wyoming, and they were just getting rid of them and recycling them. So he took them and then he carefully cut off the bottoms. He didn't use the lids. He just put the jar on top of the seedling. And he was really only using it for the seedlings, like tomatoes when they're getting started. And so he'll transplant the little seedling into, he'll put it in the bed, and then he puts the jar over it, and it's just enough to really extend and kind of get a little bit more weeks going with that seedling. And then when the plant obviously gets bigger, you need to carefully remove it, and then he just doesn't use it for the rest of the season. So it's really just an early season solution with those seedlings.
Thank you. We have a question about the wall of water, and
Yes.
Do you use the wall of water in a greenhouse situation?
Yes, you can. And you can, obviously you can use it outdoors, but it's again, similar to those cloches. You can just put it over the plant and help protect the seedling. And the wall of waters actually can stay on the plant throughout the whole summer season. And I do that with our tomatoes at our extension office. We don't have a lot of space, so we actually put them in big containers. We do container gardening with the tomatoes and the peppers. And we put it over the plant, and then the tomato, for instance, just grows up inside of it, and it has plenty of space in it. And it has vegetation that grows up above the wall of water, but that wall of water just really helps to keep that constant temperature. We're able to grow tomatoes well into October. And most people around here, if you're familiar with Teton Valley, we get frost in early September, so it definitely helps a lot.
Okay.
And if you have a greenhouse situation or a high tunnel, it could make it maybe too hot. But in that situation, you can just open up the greenhouse doors and even put the plastic up, rolling the plastic up just to get some airflow. So usually too hot is not an issue in Idaho, maybe in Treasure Valley.
Thanks, Jen. We just have a couple more questions before we move on. You mentioned that raised beds can extend the season 2 weeks in the fall. Is this a raised bed without any row cover or plastic cover? And then is the benefit of the raised bed in the fall because it keeps the plants above the cold air that sinks at night, or some other reason?
Usually it just creates enough of a microclimate that when we get those early fall frosts, it keeps it just above freezing. So I don't know, I'm not sure what picture the person was referring to, but one of those raised beds was just our small little 4-H garden. And we had plastic, I can't remember the name. We had plastic tubes kind of that are secured onto the raised bed, and we just put the fabric over it. One thing it's nice about having the plastic tubes, or if you have wire, is it keeps that fabric off of the plant, because you don't want that plant to be touching the fabric, because then it might be more susceptible to the frost. So it gets those higher growing crops a little bit more space. And then the slide that was on the right, maybe we'll go back to, let's see here. This actually was in just a small little raised bed. It was almost like a cold frame. And then they had like a little low tunnel type plastic around it. And so you can see that there's kochias also over seedlings there. So we'll go back here.
Okay, thank you. And then as you move into your next piece of the presentation, Daniel asked, should the tunnel be single wall or double wall? And what would a quality source be for the plastic? So just some questions about plastic as you move forward.
Yeah, there's a lot of like gardening supply companies that sell plastic, and our local nurseries do a pretty good job as well. I've just ordered items from gardeners.com, but I'm sure there's like some wholesale places that are more cost effective if you're a farmer and want to get more quantity. So hopefully that answers that question. With the medium tech solutions, there's several different that we would categorize as medium tech. And really this is again referring to the permanence on the landscape. So cold frames are one, we talked a little bit about that. Usually those are used in conjunction with a raised bed. And then there's mulches, hotbeds, and hoop houses. So these are both the low and the high tunnels. These cold frames can be quite creative. They can be permanent or semi-permanent structures. As you see in this little photo here, they've just used little straw bales and hay, and they put that around an old window, and it's creating a little microclimate there. One thing I kind of looking at that, I kind of wonder how much sunlight would get on the plant itself there. So that's a consideration. I don't know a ton about hotbeds. We haven't utilized them in our area, but these were very popular during the Victorian times in Great Britain and Scotland. And think about the climate that those areas had. It was cold, wet winters. They were actually able to extend and even grow maybe throughout the winter using these hotbeds. So the idea is basically using the heat generated from compost, or it could also be just like an electric source, but you're using that heat to heat up the soil temperature. And the photo on the left just shows a compost option, and it's kind of an interesting little picture. But You can use fresh straw manure and you place that under the topsoil, and then finished compost. You're going to use a 1-to-1 ratio, and you basically heat up the beds under the soil, and these heating cables can also do that. And traditionally in that Great Britain area, they only last about 2 months. I'd be very interested to see the success in Idaho, and if there's anybody on the Zoom call that have utilized this. Mulches are quite popular and they're very effective. There's lots of different mulches, and it's kind of an interchangeable term. You can also refer to vegetative mulches. So that's like even like bark mulch, or people have even used recycled glass or grass clippings and straw. But what we have shown in this slide are some plastic mulches, and they use a polyethylene sheet, and it helps to cut down on weeds, and it warms the soil. It can be quite significant. And this dramatically increases the rate of growth for your plants and for your seedlings, and can probably even extend your growing season by 2 months, or even just increase your rapid growth. One study that they've done is they find that the plants that are underneath the mulch have increased rates of, or increased carbon dioxide, and plants love the carbon dioxide. And so they're just like getting all of that and then growing much more rapidly. And at some of the farms, small farms in our area that have some bigger CSAs, they utilize even these plastic mulches around their strawberries. And so they can get strawberries much earlier in the season before some of the other vendors at the farmers market. And then there's thought that the color of the mulch can also help with the growth. So the red, if you find a color, for instance, that matches the fruiting plant, so red can go with the tomatoes, that might help with the growth of the plant. And then there's clear mulches as well. And the clear plastic helps to heat the soil up a lot more. But in our area, we just have really cold temps. There's sometimes a 40-degree temperature swing from the daytime to the nighttime. And we sometimes just can't even get hot enough for the black or for the clear mulch to be quite effective, and it can promote weed growth underneath the plastic. A lot of places, perhaps even in Idaho Falls or Treasure Valley and southern Idaho, you can use that clear plastic for solarization of the weeds, and it's a different technique than season extension. One thing to keep in mind with the plastic mulch is you're going to need to run a drip line underneath in order to irrigate, because it does block rainwater from getting into the soil. It also can be quite expensive, and they definitely have a shorter shelf life. And one downside is it does contribute to landfill waste. And then before I go on, there looks like there's a question. I'm not able to see the questions. If someone wants to interrupt and ask me the question.
I'm happy to ask you the couple of questions that have come in, Jen. One question is, do you have any experience with hugelkultur mounds?
No, and one thing I've noticed, they do try hugelkultur and maybe more of the Pacific Northwest, maybe in northern Idaho. I haven't seen it done too much down here in like the southeast Idaho area. So I know what they are. I've never utilized it myself. But I think in many ways it does emulate the hotbed situation a little bit, because if people aren't familiar with the hugelkultur, they're the best of my knowledge is you're utilizing old, like for instance, old logs, old trees. You create a bit of a raised bed system. You're using a huge composting system or composting layer, and then you plant your vegetation on the top, and then underneath, as the material is decomposing and breaking down, you're creating this warmer environment. It's heating up the soil, so it's like a hotbed. I'd be really curious. I haven't seen too much extension literature about hugelkultur. It's very popular in the permaculture world.
Thank you, Jen, for that
Yeah.
answer. And then another question, are there any sources you can recommend for finding hay or straw that hasn't been sprayed with herbicides that will hurt your garden?
For me, I've gotten straw from some farmers that I just know through my extension work, and I just point blank ask if it's been sprayed, and and people are pretty honest about it. And so I've used straw from just farmers that don't spray it. So I don't necessarily have a great source, and a lot of it's like word of mouth in your local area, and that's where Melissa touched on the local knowledge, talking to master gardeners and that sort of thing.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Those were the two questions that had come in so far.
Thank you. So Melissa is going to talk next. She's on mute. Melissa, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you, Jen, for that low and medium tech solutions. I'm going to be transitioning into the high tech solutions, but this is essentially where, you know, if you want to put them in those clear categories, it gets a little gray. And so I'm still in medium tech. And then when we move into this is a low tunnel infrastructure, but when we move into the high tunnel, I think that some of those could be medium tech because there's some do-it-yourself build instructions that I shared with the group that I think, you know, are doable. They're medium tech, and then there's some really elaborate large high tunnels that are definitely in the high tech world of season extension. So this is a raised bed, and it has rather than PVC pipes bent over the top, it has what looks to me like conduit. And I see people using conduit in Valley County a lot. There's a master gardener that took the class, and he's basically built his whole greenhouse from conduit bends. He's very talented with the conduit bender. For those of you that don't know what conduit is, it's the steel pipe that you put electrical wires in, and you can buy it from the hardware store, and you can get a conduit bender tool that makes you feel like Superwoman or Superman because you're able to bend steel bar pretty easily. And you're like, wow, you know, this is a great tool. And it is nice because the steel conduit is really sturdy. And you'll see that the bends here they did a good job. But part of it is like learning to use that tool. And so your end product will be as wonky or as precise as you are skilled with the conduit bender. And they're just going to last a little bit longer than PVC pipe. And if you're going to be using PVC pipe, then it's encouraged that you get a PVC pipe that has some UV resistance to it so it doesn't get brittle and break under the pressure of the sun. And so there is a picture of me kind of doing a demo of bending that conduit. There's a picture of the tool. And then, and yeah, I guess, you know, don't be scared to get out there and experiment with what's possible with your own hands. And I think as gardeners, that's something that just kind of innately comes with gardening. And that's a 3/4 of an inch piece of conduit. This is a high tunnel that I would think falls underneath the medium tech solutions. And it's very small. It would definitely be more of like a home gardener type of size than it would be for someone that's doing a market garden. But it's essentially 8x7, pretty easy buying of supplies and simple construction skills to get that frame together at the bottom. And then it's 2 hog panels put together to fit inside that wooden frame. And then it's a 6mm UV treated polyethylene plastic. And that polyethylene plastic 6 mil has about a 3-year lifespan on it. And so the depreciation rate of this structure, at least for the plastic, would be 3 years. And then you could use, treated lumber or your redwood or cedar on the bottom if you wanted to have that last longer, or just pine. I think for this demo, I think I just used some pine. I can't remember if it got treated or not, but if you wanted to buy thicker plastic, then they all will say on the manufacturer how long the lifespan is of that plastic. But as you go thicker in those plastics, the price of the plastic also increases. And as you're designing this structure and doing it yourself, you have to think about how much heat you need and when you're going to be growing. And so if your plan is to grow further into that cold season, you're going to get more insulative value if you have a double pane or double layer than if you just had a single layer. And so it really is specific to your growing goals on if you need a single pane or a single sheet, or if you want to double up those sheets. And you can layer the season extension techniques on top of each other. And so, for example, in this little do-it-yourself high tunnel structure, you could have little raised beds running around down each side. And then you could have little low tunnel hoops going over those raised beds, and that you would remove maybe once the plant gets established a little bit more. And so, or you can have clutches, or you can set up a little hotbed with heated coils going underneath a certain specific area to be able to do your germination table. And so kind of combining all of this knowledge that you have about season extension to be able to make it work for what you want is it's essentially the next step. Like, have your plan, have your goal, and then figure out what tools you need to use in order to get there and how you can layer those. So there's, I think those plans were shared with you on how to create that structure, and you could make it longer, or you could do multiple of those. And we didn't frame in the door, but this little structure took us about an hour to assemble once we got all the supplies together in one place. And then it would take probably a half a day if you were to build out that door and window. And just like with any greenhouse or high tunnel, as soon as you create that enclosed space, you have to think about the principles of ventilating it. You have to think about resting that space and not using it intensively, because as soon as you have this type of structure, you're going to attract different pests that might plague you if you continually grow and you don't ever rest and solarize that space to be able to maintain that space for healthy conditions. This is a picture of one of the master gardeners' structure using the hog panels in Valley County, and she didn't actually create a full frame, and this is much larger structure than the one I created. But on the left side, she has her 2x6. And then on the right side, she actually just used rebar to just secure that hog panel in place. And so there's a lot of ways to get creative with this paneling. This is obviously also called a high tunnel, but this is definitely high tech. This is one of the grants that was received by Alpha Nursery in our area, and they did a U-pick greenhouse at their nursery. And so this is their high tunnel structure. The first winter, though, it did collapse. And so then they had to repair it. And I think that's just thinking about that maintenance that's required through the winter. And I believe now that they take the plastic off and just let the snow fall through the ribbing. And so, think about your strategy to maintain this equipment. This is another USDA high tunnel that was received in Valley County through that grant process. And this is at Stegner Farm. And this is in the fall. And you can see he's using row cover underneath that high tunnel. So he's layering those season extension techniques. And he also uses that because he's an organic grower to be able to protect his crops from grasshoppers, because grasshoppers are a big deal in our area, especially in late summer, fall. There's the link to be able to learn more about that high tunnel program with USDA and apply for that process. And those high tunnels for these farmers, they're essentially using them to extend their season at the beginning or at the end of their growing season. There's also some that have been built in Valley County that are put on tracks like rollers. And so you can roll them across the field. And so that's one way to be able to rest that space and then activate that space by moving that frame along a roller. So there's different designs that you can take advantage of. This is a picture of a geothermal greenhouse at Stegner Farm. And they use this greenhouse to grow greens year round, but it's definitely a different design. It's built into the ground. It has a fan that circulates air from the earth up into the greenhouse, keeping the temperatures regulated throughout the winter. And then it has insulated north-facing wall. And so this is a picture of what it looks like inside. And right now, this is them resting that space and solarizing the beds to be able to reduce the amount of aphid activity that they were having in that greenhouse. But they grow vertically, and you can see the strings along the walkway there. They'll grow vertically in the summer, actually, in this space with a lot of ventilation. And then in the winter, they grow greens. And so right now in February, I can go into town and get some greens from Stegner Farm, which is pretty amazing in the winter, and awesome to be able to do that. This is just a picture that I found, and I just gave shout out to Calgary, but this is another one of those passive solar greenhouses. And I liked this picture because if you think about growing and your goal is to grow in the winter, you're trying to capture the sun rays from the sun when it's at the lowest point in the sky. And so I liked this picture because it has a really steep wall to be able to capture those sun rays, because the whole purpose and design of this structure is to grow during that winter time. And so you want to be capturing the sun rays at 45-degree angle of how they hit your glazing. And glazing is just the term used for plastic or glass or whatever it is that you're lining your greenhouse with, or your structure. And so that's the angle of inclination. You want it to be somewhat 45-degree angle. You can see that they're accomplishing that with this steep slope. Other things that you would incorporate into this deep winter, this passive solar greenhouse, is the idea of thermal mass and passive cooling. And so thermal mass is when you are having big tanks of water, like you see in this greenhouse here, or when there's, pieces like big pieces of rock or cob or any other kind of earthen structure that's going to be gathering the sunlight during the day and warming up, and then slowly releasing that through the evening to be able to, it helps mitigate those drastic temperature extremes that we have. Jen was saying, sometimes 40 degrees difference between day and night. And so the passive cooling and the thermal mass heating during the day, it just helps temper that temperature difference in these spaces. Now this is a Walipini. And Jen, feel free to plug some comments into the chat if you have additional things that you wanted to share about this. But I haven't found a lot of research in extension world about this structure. But this is a structure that basically pulls off that principle of having more even temperature in the earth. And so it's a greenhouse that's dug into the ground. And if you're going to be doing this structure, I think it would be important to think about your water drainage. Also, if you get snow, you'd have to think about, removing the snow or just taking the glazing off completely, because this would be probably really difficult. Well, I can imagine this would be very difficult to maintain in wintry climates. And then you have to think about the glazing and coming up with the best choice for you. And a lot of this glazing comes down to the initial cost of what it would take, and then how often you'd have to update it. And then also what kind of insulation or insulative value do you need to be able to create the growing conditions that you want. And so polyethylene is that just that plastic sheet, and you can do different millimeters of thickness. And I think in most places, one sheet is fine unless you're really trying to extend your growing season deep into the beginning or the end of your season. And then you can use acrylic or polycarbonate double layer structure panels, which are a little bit more expensive. And then you can also use glass. And there's pros and cons to each one of these, but transmission is a big factor, where Jen was talking about, the permeability of light going through those surfaces. And then also, the insulative value. And so single pane glass, there's a double pane glass. And then also if you're in a really harsh climate, glass is not very insulative, and therefore maybe some of the plastic products would provide more insulative value. There's some greenhouses made out of glass here in Valley County, and some of the people have shared that they've had a hard time with the glass shattering because ice has formed on the top and have busted out the panels. And then also if you're using glass, you have to have a really stable frame because it's very heavy. And so I think there's a lot to consider when it comes to glazing. And there's pros and cons to each. I included an extension publication coming out of Utah that kind of goes into more depth about each one of these things that you might want to consider. But when you are buying these plastic sheets, make sure that they are UV stabilized. Some of the stuff that you can get at the local hardware store that it says polyethylene sheets is not UV stabilized, and that's not going to last probably more than one season. And so if you're spending the money and the time, you might as well get the product that's going to serve you best for the purpose, and get that UV stabilized material. Minnesota, they've been doing really inspiring, wonderful things when it comes to greenhouses. And I encourage you all to read the Cold Climate Greenhouse Resource book. And they have some really amazing, inspiring TED Talks about people doing deep winter greenhouses off their house and reversing prediabetes, and just, those TED Talk kind of heartwarming stories. And so I encourage you to read and learn from what's happening elsewhere. And the University of Minnesota is definitely stepping up to be a leader in creating these growing spaces to grow throughout the winter, if that is the goal of your season extension infrastructure. And so here's some additional resources on high tunnel grant opportunity, on high tunnels with SARE, and then just short season high altitude gardening with UI extension publications. Are there any questions that came in?
There are some questions. So the first question is, I'm interested in a keyhole garden. Do you have any experience with them?
I do not. Jen, if you have any experience, feel free to unmute yourself, but I'm happy to look into that because I love doing research on this topic.
I'm just trying to think, if the keyhole garden, is that the design of the layout of the keyhole garden? I'm just thinking permaculture. Is that whoever's asking that question? I think the idea is just to mimic more of the natural environment and nature in terms of how you lay it out. I'm trying to see if the question is in the chat.
Okay, great. So perhaps that's something that we could look into additional resources related to see if we can find any through extension. So Christine is asking, what is solarizing a bed?
So solarization is a technique that you would use to be able to warm the soil up, and you can use it to be able to reduce the amount of pests or reduce the amount of the seed bed so potential weed seeds that are in that bed. And so you basically just kind of cover whatever your growing space is, whether that be within your greenhouse, the raised beds, or some people will actually solarize a space before they even start their garden to be able to just reduce that weed seed bed. But when you're in a greenhouse, if there's any like pest eggs that are laid in the soil, then it'll just give a chance to be able to kill those off. And it's simple. You just put the plastic sheeting down on the surface and you secure it around the edges, and you just make sure it's secured around the edges. And a lot of growers in Valley County, or even the softball field at the high school, they will actually solarize the fields and put these sheeting panels on top of the snow to be able to melt the snow off earlier, to be able to start growing in that space or playing softball. And so it's just a way to heat up the space immediately under that plastic to either melt the snow off or kill pests or weeds.
Thank you, Melissa. We have a question from Marion, and this is talking about creating heat sinks within your hoop houses or high tunnels. So, Maureen asks, would rock pass help in a hoop house if used in between rows?
I think that thermal mass adds value because it's going to be capturing that heat and then slowly releasing it at night. And so I think that would be one of the values of using the rock for your surfaces.
Thank you. And then a question from Mindy. Can I use the water for my plants that I'm using to heat the high tunnel? For example, if I put stock tanks of water in there and they grow algae, would that harm my plants?
Jen, do you have any?
Well, I'm one thing I would be curious about is if it would just promote algae growth throughout the whole garden. And if you're using like a greenhouse, like plastic or even like just floating row cover, you're going to create an environment that's it's a hotter, more humid environment, and you might see algae growth. Sometimes, I mean, often that really doesn't interfere with the growth of the plants themselves, but it just can create maybe even conditions where you might get some more disease just because of the humidity and that sort of thing. And the algae itself can actually be kind of a neat little mulch in between plants, but I haven't heard too many concerns about it.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. So.
I've had it grow in our 4-H gardens, and I just find it to be kind of annoying. So I've just peeled off it's really like almost like a little carpet on top of the soil, and I just peeled it off. And if you don't remove it all, you'll see a lot more growth. You could maybe then create like a little fun 4-H project and do like a little fairy garden or something with it. I don't know.
Thanks, Jen.
Yeah.
We have another question, and it says, I have a polycarbonate home-built greenhouse, and it looks like she's wrapping the entire inside with bubble wrap to try to store more thermal heat. With this design, will she use too much light? And I'm wondering, perhaps there might be a little bit of insight about light meters to figure out what the amount of light is in these different types of structures. So. Melissa, for some reason, your sound went really quiet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I think when you're buying an actual product, it'll give you the transmission rate, of light. But when you're improvising and using bubble wrap, then you all of a sudden lose, the product integrity of saying transmission rate is this. So I like your idea of using a light meter, Colette. And then there's also products that you can buy that are double paned that will create the bubble effect inside, but they are, more expensive. So I can see why you'd want to improvise and use a resource that you have readily on hand, but yeah, it's hard to measure that. So a light meter might be a good call.
I was just looking, I finally saw the question and answer thing other than the chat. And I see a question from Patty Campitelli. And she asked if we shouldn't make we should not make, she had heard that you should not make mounds, just mulch around the plants once they've sprouted, and this would deter weed growth. And that they also suggested leaving weeds to grow in the garden. So we in Extension would never suggest leaving weeds to grow in the garden. And it will just create more of a headache down the road. And then in our area, creating mounds is really effective, and a lot of our small farmers, most of them do that. They will just in their little garden beds, they'll just mound the soil up a little bit. And then that also creates nice little walking paths in between the rows. So I don't know where Patty read that, but I would say making mounds is great. It's a great tool. And adding that drip irrigation along that row would be great for that as well.
And then another one of the perks of raised beds is that it heats the soil earlier in the season too. And so even if it's a dug raised bed, yep, it's helping, you have complete control over the integrity of what soil you have in those raised beds, and it's helping heat it quicker into the season. And it's kind of cool because you can go out into a snowy field and see raised beds that have completely melted off. And so you can see that principle when you're observing those microclimates in the early spring.
Thank you, Melissa and Jen. This has been a great webinar. I want to respect everyone's time as we're now just have approached the hour. I want to remind everyone that we did email both a handout of all of the slides that have the links that we were referred to today, and also a publication on do-it-yourself greenhouses. So you'll have those in your email inbox. As I said, this is the second webinar for Cultivating Success. Next week's webinar in our January theme of planning for your markets and reaching your customers is 4 strategies to reach your customers online. That's going to be presented by Emily Black with Lone Mountain Farms in Athol. Emily is actually by profession a marketing specialist, and she is also a producer. So please join us next week. Moving into February, our theme is going to switch to digging into soils and compost, and our February 2nd webinar is going to be on managing and monitoring soil fertility. And this is going to be kind of like a 201 or 301 level, so not an introductory level to soil fertility, but a little bit more advanced. You can find all of our upcoming webinars for this entire season, which goes through April, at the Cultivating Success website under our webinar series. We actually determined this year's webinar topics based on the evaluations that we received in the past. So please take a couple minutes to provide some feedback to our speakers today about the content of this webinar, and then let us know what other topics you're interested in, because they really do make a difference as we plan for the future. So you are going to be able to access this webinar when we close, or access the survey when we close today's webinar, and tomorrow you will receive an email with a link to this post-webinar survey, as well as a link to the webinar recording. So with that, we really thank you for joining us today. We hope that you have a great week, and that we perhaps get to see you tomorrow on the Marketing Online webinar. Again, thank you, Melissa and Jen, and everyone have a great day.